Hey there, gang. Mary Rose here. Now, listen, we all know it's good to make a good first impression. It's very important when we meet people in life. It's very important to put our best foot forward. This is true of us personally, and it's also true of our writing. Today, we're going to talk about beginnings. Now, I think we've all heard that it's super important to have like a strong opening. It's really important to have like a good first line, a good first page. A lot of times we're asked to submit the first 5 pages or 10 pages of our work if we're applying to a conference or a program, or we want to, seek an agent and this kind of thing. So there's all kinds of practical reasons why having a very strong beginning serves us as writers. But here's the most important reason: it serves you as a writer to have a strong beginning. Because why? If you start your story heading in the wrong direction, you are going to be in trouble all the way through. So beginnings are really important, not just when your book is done and you're trying to make a good impression on others, but during your own creative process. That's what I'm going to focus on today. We're going to talk about beginnings, and I'm going to go over the 5 biggest and most common mistakes that I see in writers' drafts. So this is really essential information. I am glad you're here. So let's dive in. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself for anybody who is new to this live stream. My name is Mary Rose Wood. I am an author. I'm best known for writing middle grade fiction, which means that if you know an 8 to 12-year-old who really likes to read, you ought to check out my books. I'm best known for a 6-book series called The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place. My most recent middle grade book is called Alice's Farm, A Rabbit's Tale. Summer's coming up. I know families are making their reading list, so why don't you check those out if you don't know those books already? I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller. Path of the Storyteller is my own platform for teaching and mentoring writers. It is an incredible community, and this is such a big week for Path of the Storyteller because our spring 2023 cohort is graduating. They've got their final module in hand. They're doing their final lessons this week. We're going to have our final a small group coaching tomorrow. As I record this on a Wednesday. We're going to meet again tomorrow, have our little graduation party, and then I'm going to be welcoming a bunch of them into the Storyteller Circle, which is an ongoing membership community for writers who've been through the Path of the Storyteller program. It is just a delicious group of writers, and I am so proud of each and every one of them. I invite any of you out there who think that a little mentorship and training and being part of a community like that would be of benefit to your writing to come check it out. One of the easy ways to get started putting yourself on the Path of the Storyteller email list is to go over to the website and help yourself to a present. It's a collection of writing prompts. There's 30 writing prompts, and they are waiting for you at www.pathofthestoryteller.com/challenge. They're lots of fun, and they are arranged in the order of story structure: beginnings, which we're going to talk about today, middle, and end. So if you do these writing prompts in order, you're going to teach yourself a little something about story structure, something we talk about a lot at Path of the Storyteller and also here on the YouTube channel. All right. So before we dive in, speaking of community, let me just say hi. We've got some folks here attending live. Jaren, very proud to have made the first comment. Congratulations, Jaren. Punctuality is such a virtue. Nancy is here. Lovely to see you, Nancy. Hillary, so pleased that you're here. Anne is here. We've got a Facebook user here whose name I don't know, but that's okay. I'll find out who you are later. I'm really glad to have folks participating here live. As always, if you're here live, you can feel free to post your questions and observations as we go. We will address them. If you're not here live but watching the replay, that's what the comments are for. You can always leave a comment. I like to read the comments, and I always look at them and reply to them. All right, guys, are we ready to begin about beginnings? I think we should get started. since that's what we're here to talk about. Now, I'm going to say something kind of obvious. When we draft a book, most of us, most of the time, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, tend to start drafting at the beginning. Now, we will all have our own different pre-writing rituals. Maybe some of us have notebooks full of notes and ideas for scenes that happen in the middle. Maybe we've had a brainstorm, like an inspiration of some kind. So we already have an idea of what the ending is going to be, right? So it doesn't mean that we don't have ideas for what happens later in the book. But typically, I think most of us, most of the time, start drafting at the beginning. Now, here's the problem. When we start at the beginning, or when we start, no matter where we start, our expertise about the book we're about to write is at its lowest point. That's just logic, right? We haven't written very much of it yet. We haven't written anything of it yet. We don't know as much about it as we're going to learn as we go. We don't know maybe about the voice. We haven't fully explored the characters. We haven't fully explored the setting. We may not be crystal clear about what the story is going to be. We might tend toward being pantsers, So we are at our most ignorant point when we write the beginning. And yet, the beginning is the roadmap for the entire book. So you can see right away that we have a little bit of a problem. It's like we are trying to create a definitive roadmap to a territory that we have not even visited. We know nothing about the place we're going to go. And yet we've been handed a sharpened pencil and a big sheet of paper and say, draw the map. And the map you draw now is the map you're going to end up following. And you're like, but, I know nothing about this place. I've never been there. This is the tricky part about writing beginnings. And so it is no wonder that when we draft a book, the beginnings tend to need work. They need a little extra attention. We will often find that we write a draft and the beginning is, it just raises a lot of red flags. And if the map is wrong, the whole journey is going to be off. So if we don't learn to identify at least the basics, what is the compass at least? Let's get our directions in order. Let's tell north from south at least before we wander too much into this unmapped territory. If we don't do this, we're going to end up with a draft that needs so much revision. It's going to feel a lot like having to start over. And I know how that's not how we want to end up. I just know how not happy we are as writers when we do that, when we work so hard to write a whole draft only to get to the end and realize that our compass was turned around the whole time. And we took this long, arduous march in the wrong direction. Okay. There's a lot that the beginning has to do. The beginning has to establish who our main character is. It establishes the setting. It establishes the need for the story to take place in the first place, right? So you just see there's just so much work to do. We sort of define what the whole book is about. So I want to break this down for you all. I'm going to try to get through 5 of the main things that I see going wrong in writers' drafts. And when I get to the end of today's talk, I want to offer a little encouragement about kind of the inevitability of having to spend more time sorting out the beginning than you need and why it's important to do that. Okay. A little word of experience. I've written a lot of books and I know that I would much rather do all that work pointing in the right direction than in the wrong one. So I hope to give you that encouragement by the time we're done today. So stick around to the end. All right, gang. The first big thing that I see in writers' drafts that is a miss in the beginning. And by the way, I'm also going to use the term first act in case anyone's unfamiliar with that. I know some of you who might be watching are new to the idea of story structure. So we talk about stories in 3 parts, beginning, middle, end. So this is also called 3-act structure, first act, second act, third act. So you might hear me say beginning or first act, okay? So this first act, number 1, here's where it can go wrong. It fails to demonstrate, it fails to really show that there is an urgent need for someone and something to change. Key word here is change. Stories themselves are all about transformation. We all know this. If a story begins and then sometime later it ends and everything is the same way it was at the beginning, the average reader is going to say, huh, nothing happened, right? We mark what happened according to what has changed. How big was the change? How meaningful was the change? How irrevocable was the change, right? So, this idea of change and transformation is at the very core of what makes a story, right? And a story doesn't just describe change. If you want to think about it as an engine, right, as a machine, story has a function. The story itself is the engine of change. It is the cause of change. What we depict when we write a story are the incremental steps of a transformation. So now that we know that a story is all about transformation, in the very first act, if there seems to be no need for change, we've just failed to establish that there even needs to be a story at all. And this is a big mistake. So let's talk about the types of needs for change that you need to establish in a first act. First of all, you need to establish your main character, whom I often call the hero, right? This hero is going to be the primary figure who is transformed by the story. It's their need for change that we've all come to witness and to participate in, right? Empathetically as readers. Just as importantly as the hero needing to change, they also need to be the agent, the proactive agent of that change. Because if the change just happens to them, then they are like the passive recipient of an event, but that's not quite the same thing as being the hero of a story where their change is earned incrementally by the things they do, the obstacles they encounter, and all the rest. Okay. So establishing the hero's personal need for change has to happen in the first act. The other thing that has to be established in the first act is kind of the why for this need for change, right? So we need to know what's been going on in the hero's world. You might call this the backstory or the circumstances as they exist, not only on page one, but before the book even starts. There is backstory. Chances are this backstory is going to let the reader know something about why what's been going on is not the best. It's something that really needs to change. We also have to establish what's going on right now, because what's going on right now might not be the same thing that's been going on in the past, right? There might be backstory, for example, about Harry Potter's parents being killed by a wizard, right? But what's going on right now is that he's living with the Dursleys and it's awful, right? So there's both the backstory of the past and there's what's happening right now. So we need a pretty good picture of not everything that ever happened to the hero, right? Not everything that's going on in their world, but what is it precisely that makes it unmistakable that this situation really has to change? Okay. We have to make sure the reader understands right away why what's going on is unsustainable long term. I like to use the image of a house of cards, right? I'm sure all of us at one point have built a house of cards. It's fun to do. You get out a deck of cards, you balance them. But what do we know about a house of cards? If somebody slams the door or jostles the table or opens the window and lets a little breeze in, it topples very easily. So, what we're trying to establish, this unsustainable situation that our hero is in, is essentially a house of cards. It's standing up, but it's not going to take much to knock it over because it's unsustainable. It's not the kind of thing that really can go on forever. It's just completely unsatisfactory. Couple of examples of the kinds of change that heroes need. They might have a very oppressive external environment, like Harry Potter living in the Dursleys' house, right? He's very poorly treated. Jane Eyre, at the beginning of Jane Eyre, is she's taken in with relatives who treat her very badly, right? They don't want to be taken care of her and they treat her very badly. So this is the kind of thing that in an oppressive external circumstance, maybe it's been going on for a while, but we really don't want to see this continue. It's truly unsustainable. Another thing that establishes a need for change, if the hero has an internal flaw or condition that the reader can see, right? Because we're going to manifest it, we're going to demonstrate it with some external details. That also can't, it just is no good. It can't go on this way. And so if they are, for example, Ebenezer Scrooge, and their soul is consumed by greed and miserliness and selfishness and a lack of empathy for their fellow humans, this is a house of cards, right? This can't go on like this, right? It just can't go on. It's no good. It's not something we want to see continue. So they could have external oppression. They could have an internal flaw. They could have something that doesn't read so dramatically as Ebenezer Scrooge, but a character like Bilbo Baggins, who is introduced to us immediately as kind of living a less than authentic life. He's living the life of a very conventional hobbit, but his true inner nature is much more than that. He's kind of suppressed half of his authentic personality in order to be conventional and fit in with hobbits, but he's not really 100% hobbit. This is what I mean by some internal house of cards, right? Some internal situation. Can a hero have both external oppression and internal flaw? Of course. I mean, you get to play with all these great ingredients. The third thing that occurs to me as well that can create a need for change, if there is some clock ticking on the hero's circumstance, if there's a deadline, if something is about to change, right? One of the examples that you can think of is any story that's like a coming of age story, right? You know, kids grow up and have to go off on their own. There's so many stories about kids going off to school, going off to college, people joining the service, like just sort of entering the adult world. It's why we have this whole category of the coming of age story. I would argue that it's one of the reasons that the category of young adult literature is so incredibly popular, and not just for teenagers. It is essentially our version, our contemporary version of the classic coming of age story. You know, a young person takes on their role in society. Think of a book like The Hunger Games, right? Like a young person steps up into adulthood, steps into leadership, right? And steps into their role in the world. That's a coming of age story. So that's just a few suggestions, but they're kind of important, right? Oppressive external circumstances, some kind of internal flaw or lack of authenticity that's holding back their growth, or some kind of ticking clock, right? That just time is moving forward and it's time for something to change. And some combination, right, of those three is also fine. So I hope that's clear. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about building a house of cards in the first act. It's got to have these qualities. So that's number one. Number two on my list of the 5 big flaws that I see in first acts that come across my desk: failure to topple this house of cards and get the story started. So let's say a writer has gotten the message that a hero has to be in some kind of trouble at the beginning of a story. Their life is not great for all these reasons, right? Page after page after page of depicting this hero's unhappy life goes on, and nothing happens to topple this house of cards. Now, remember what I said about a house of cards. If you don't slam the door, if you don't jostle the table, if you don't open the window and let a breeze in, it may sit there all day. You can build a house of cards on the dining room table and leave it, and maybe it'll stand up for a long time. I just need to make it clear that the story that you're going to tell doesn't really get started until this house of cards gets toppled. So something needs to happen very quickly in your beginning that lets us know that this is the moment that the story has begun. This house of cards, even if it's been sitting on the dining room table for weeks, months, years, it's gone now. We've got to deal with it, right? This is the moment the story begins. Now, I'm going to use an example that I hope will make you smile or at least crave Italian food. Think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Everybody knows this, right? There's this fantastic building in the city of Pisa in Italy that leans just dramatically. It visibly leans to one side. Now, this creates, talk about a house of cards. When you look at a picture of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it looks like it's ready to fall down. Now, here's the truth. It was built, they started building it. It took a really long time to build. I actually checked this before going live with you guys today. It was built in the 12th century, or it started being built in the 12th century. That's the 1100s, okay? Super long time ago. And it started to lean even as they were building it. So this was a precarious situation from the beginning, right? Now, it's been leaning for, almost 1,000 years now, right? If we decided that we wanted to write a story about the day the Leaning Tower of Pisa fell, when are we going to start that story? Are we going to start that story in the 12th century and write volumes and volumes and volumes of, I don't know, what's going on at the tower as it leans and continues to lean? People looking at it saying, "Oops, that's unsustainable. Someday that thing's going to fall." But the truth is, it doesn't fall. It doesn't fall. It still hasn't fallen. So if we want to write that story about the day the Leaning Tower of Pisa fell, when are we going to start that story? We're going to start it just before it actually falls, right? We're going to have to decide what's going to finally topple it. And that's when our story starts. So part of this requirement of first acts that we topple this house of cards and get the story started requires us to decide when the storytelling needs to start. It needs to start right before the toppling, very soon. Oh, sometimes as if as the toppling's happening, or maybe a little bit before. Okay. And I just want to say that again, I'm talking about common mistakes that people make in first acts. They either start way too soon, sometimes too late, more often too soon, right? Some of my favorite examples, like if you wanted to write up, and people have written so many books or movies about the Titanic, right? Are you going to write a story about the Titanic that gets to 9/10 of the way through before the iceberg gets hit and the boat starts to sink? No, if people come to you for a story about the Titanic, you're going to have the boat hit the iceberg pretty soon. That's the story, right? This is the story of the Titanic. You need the iceberg. The boat's got to sink. You don't save that for the last 10 pages, right? That's an example of starting a story way too soon. I mentioned the Hunger Games a couple of minutes ago. I mean, the Hunger Games is so well structured. It clearly starts on what day? The day of the reaping. That's the day the Hunger Games starts. There's no need to start that book 3 weeks before and spend a lot of time and pages and readers' patience getting to know everyone. No, let's start on the day of the reaping. We'll get to know everyone soon enough while the story is in progress. All right. Hamlet, of course, another favorite example of mine. We don't meet Hamlet when he's just, a little baby prince of Denmark. We meet him after after his father has been murdered, after his mother has married his uncle. It's an unsustainable situation for sure. We meet him just as the ghost of his father appears on the ramparts of the castle. That is a toppling of a house of cards, right? So I think I've made my point. This is the second thing, that once that house of cards is established, you've got to knock it over fast. So you've got to know what that toppling is. Is it an iceberg? Is it the day of the reaping? Is it the appearance of the ghost? What is it in your story? All right, let's move on to number 3. Number 3 on my list of 5 things that writers tend to get wrong in their beginnings, in their first acts, is a failure to have the hero take center stage once that story actually begins. So there's an unsustainable world, maybe something topples, right? A story is going to get started. The hero has to be at the center of this. It is not useful to your first act to have something dreadful happen and then have other characters start to lead the way toward finding a solution while your hero just kind of watches or observes or narrates or, just takes a back seat or is just sort of part of a whole group without in some way being distinct from them, right? Once this toppling happens, if the hero remains passive, it is no good. It is the hero's inner need for change, in a sense, that has kind of summoned the storytelling gods to knock this house of cards over to begin with. So everything that happens from this point on is part of that design of transformation that is like rising from the hero. So this is not the moment to have your hero in the background. One of the big questions that will come up in a book where the hero is not absolutely taking center stage right away once the story begins, is that there's a question about why they are the ones to solve this toppling, right? This whatever toppling you've come up with in this unsustainable condition. If you let other characters demonstrate that they are more qualified, more able, more ready to do the thing that now is going to need to be done as a result of this world toppling, you've just kind of knocked your hero off the center, like you've knocked them out of the center of the book because other characters seem to be more ready, willing, and able to do it, right? So you have to think about both the hero reacting to this toppling, actively reacting, taking action about it, not freezing up and not knowing what to do, right? Taking some action about it. And you also have to imagine that your hero is uniquely qualified to be the one to move the story forward, to deal with this thing. A story that has a structure, like Harry Potter, that where this central figure it's part of his defining characteristic that he has this unique qualification, right? He's sort of, it's like a chosen one type story, right? That which is a very classic hero's journey structure. There's something about this figure that is the one who can do it, right? An interesting counterpoint, I mentioned Bilbo Baggins, and I know I've got lots of Hobbit fans out there. The adventure, the sort of toppling that comes Bilbo's way is this arrival of this invitation, to adventure. And Gandalf comes and says, I need you to do this thing. And the irony is, of course, that Bilbo is very poorly qualified to do the thing that Gandalf says he needs to do. But Gandalf insists, no, you're the one. You're really the only one who can do this. Now, Gandalf probably knows something we don't, being a magical figure. But I just want you to see that there is this quality of uniqueness that is built into strong beginnings. Only Ebenezer Scrooge can fix the condition of his own soul, right? He is the only one who can do this. Nobody can do it for him. So so this isn't, just about like these sort of chosen one hero stories. It just has to do with the centrality of the hero. So if stuff happens in the first act and there's an unsustainable situation and something topples, but your hero has not been defined really as the true center of this, the one from whom now all is going to proceed, the character whose journey of transformation we're there for, that's a big problem. Okay? So central hero. Let your hero take center stage right in the beginning. Now, I'm going to go to number 4, and this is also a huge one. If the first act fails to establish the hero's mission clearly, we are in big trouble. Now, I want to define the word mission for anybody that might be, new to this channel, maybe not used to hearing the way I talk about story structure. I use the word mission to mean something really specific. It's the thing that your hero is going to spend most of the book trying to do. And it's pretty simple when you think about it, but it's counterintuitive to many writers that a novel, something as complex as a novel, can really be about one character trying to do one thing for most of it. But it's true. It's just true. If you think about the books that you love, even the movies that you love, if they have fairly conventional narrative structures, they are about a character trying to do a thing. There's a bank that needs to be robbed. There's a murder that needs to be solved. There's a person that needs to be rescued, right? Like, that's it. That's what stories are about. It's a person trying to do a thing. And this is what I call the mission. Now, it's not as casual as I just made it sound, because the thing that this person has to do is important. It has some stakes about it. If you are Meg Murray in A Wrinkle in Time, right, a middle grade classic, the thing that you set out to do is to rescue your father, to find your missing father who is in a very dangerous predicament. It's very, very high stakes. It's something she desperately wants to do. She'll die trying to do that, So that's an example. If you're Michael Corleone, you're going to spend the whole story, at least of Godfather 1. I know it's a trilogy. I'm not going to get into all the structural complexities of it, but you're going to spend most of the movie like trying to do just enough to hold your mob family together so that you can get out again, right? And it's not going to work out the way you want, and that makes it a tragedy. But that's it. Like, that's the story. That's what's going to happen. And every scene of the storytelling is going to be like the next step on that journey of that character trying to do that thing. So we've got high stakes, and we've also got this incremental quality. And guess what that incremental quality delivers? It delivers transformation. Transformation does not happen all at once. A story in which a hero complains for 300 pages and then their fairy godmother shows up at the end and goes dink and solves all their problems is not that satisfying. We want to see our heroes struggle through the mission incrementally, step by step, growing, changing, learning what they need to know, so that by the time they get to the end, they have earned the transformation. It is satisfying to the reader, okay? So if we fail to establish what the mission is in the end of the first act, or in a pinch at the very, very beginning of the second act, we literally have not drawn a roadmap to anywhere. We are now in the second act, which is, that a subject for another live stream. I have talked about second acts before, so if you want to dive into that now, you can look on the channel for second act focused talks. But we've got to know what direction we're going in by the end of the first act, or the story is just not going to begin. If Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz never gets sent to Oz. Like, her mission when she gets there is to get home to Kansas again. Every scene in the second act of The Wizard of Oz is about Dorothy doing incrementally, step by step, what it takes, what she believes it's going to take for her to get sent home to Kansas again at the end. It's most of the story. So our first act, our beginning, in a sense, is like, if you think of an archer sort of pulling back the bowstring, right? The mission is like the release of the arrow, and then that flight of the arrow is most of the story. It is your hero aiming at the target, at the mission, the thing they want to accomplish. Rescue father, get home to Kansas, marry Mr. Rochester, pick one, pick your favorite, survive the Hunger Games. Pick a story that means something to you, and you'll see that the hero of that story is spending most of it trying to accomplish something really, really clear, really specific, something that the reader knows what it is. Okay? It is so common for writers, for the reason that I described earlier, right? Because they don't yet know that much about their story. They haven't yet had the experience of exploring their characters and the world of their story. They're drafting, they're starting at the beginning, and they're using this drafting process to just kind of feel their way around. And the idea of settling on the mission is like the moment where the book becomes about one thing as opposed to the 10 other possibilities that the writer is tinkering with. Does this sound familiar to anybody out there? Right? This is what drafting can feel like. We've got a lot of possibilities. We sort of think, well, it could be about this, could be about this, maybe my hero needs to do this. And so we write and write in this exploratory way. But we know that the minute we pick a mission, that this is no longer a story about 10 possible things. It's about one thing. It's about one thing. Yes, there can be subplots. The Scarecrow can have a subplot. The Tin Man can have a subplot, right? The Cowardly Lion can have a subplot. There can be a little romance subplot. Even Meg, Mary in A Wrinkle in Time, while she's rescuing father, has like a little romance with, her friend from school who's one of her co-travelers on the adventure. Yes, there can be things woven in, but there's no question what the main spine of that story is. That is the mission. All right? Writers find it hard to choose. Writers know that once they pick one, that they have set the course for the whole voyage. And, decision paralysis is a thing. It really is. It can be hard to choose. We have to be brave. If we don't commit to one mission, we will never write a second act and a third act that makes any sense. We're just going to be wandering the whole time. So you got to have that clarity in the first act. Okay. And speaking of this, I'm going to move on to my fifth and final big common flaw that I see in first acts. This one, luckily, is easy to fix, even though sometimes writers have a hard time doing the necessary fixing. And it has to do with pace. It has to do with pace. I often see a first act that is simply much too long, or sometimes so short as to be almost non-existent. It's more often that I see a first act that's too long. Now, why might this happen in a draft? Well, if you've been listening hard, I think you can probably see that if we are over involved with trying to maybe establish the hero's unsustainable circumstances, we might go on for a long time trying to do that because we haven't yet decided how to topple those circumstances. Like, we're sort of afraid to get to the moment where the Leaning Tower of Pisa actually topples, where the ghost of Hamlet's father appears, right? Where Gandalf arrives. We're just busy exploring, or we think that we're setting it up for the reader, that the reader needs like a lot of backstory, a lot of setup to understand what's going to happen 10 or 20 or 30 pages from now. That is such a classic mistake. The reader wants the story to begin. Full stop. That's what the reader wants. When you read something, that's what you want. You know it's true. The backstory, the circumstances that the reader needs to know are simply the ones that are pertinent to establishing what is unsustainable about the world. Everything else can be woven in while the story is in progress. We do not need to set things up and then start the story. Start the story, let the reader know what they need to know to understand what's happening, why this world is unsustainable, what topples it, why our hero is in desperate, urgent need of transformation, right? That's what we need to know. We don't need the whole history of the town. If it matters, you can weave it in later. Chances are it doesn't matter that much. It probably doesn't matter as much as you think. You can do it really swiftly. Okay. So this is the kind of thing that can make a first act go on and on. The writer is spending time setting things up before actually starting the storytelling. That's an example of starting storytelling way too soon, like in the 11th century, right? Instead of the day that the Leaning Tower of Pisa calls. The other thing that we sort of already talked about is this idea of being reluctant to choose a mission, being reluctant to decide, unable to decide. And so there's just a lot of writing of things that maybe bad things happen. Maybe the writer knows that things have to like be kind of lined up against the hero. But if the hero is passive and not uniquely qualified to do something about this like substantial toppling, like I know how to make the Leaning Tower of Pisa stand up again. I know I'm going to find father. I got to go see the wizard to go back to Kansas. Like, unless the hero is willing to stand up and do something about the situation, this story's not going to start. So that sort of passive hero or the hero not being uniquely qualified will also cause this like drawn out first act. Okay. So that's why first acts can go on way, 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 way too long, right? The writer's in love with the setting. I mean, there could be all sorts of mistakes. I want to say, now, having said this, how long is the right amount? Like, how do you know it's too long? Well, here's something to bear in mind. One of the reasons I like to use the movie of The Wizard of Oz as an example is that it's so vivid, right? Imagine if Dorothy didn't get to Oz, like if the movie stayed in black and white and didn't get into Technicolor till it was like halfway through. It's too late. There's this sense that a reader or a viewer, anyone consuming a story, there's a sense that they have that it doesn't really start until we get to the second act. Like if you think about The Wizard of Oz, you think about Oz, you think about the moment it turns into Technicolor. You want that to happen as fast as possible. You want to get to that moment as quickly as possible because that is where the story starts. The story of the Titanic, no matter how much backstory, love interests, great clothes, music and dancing, right? Historical trivia, no matter how interested you are, the story of the Titanic does not begin until it hits the iceberg. Okay? So you need to have that happen as soon as possible. So, what is the right length of a first act? It's kind of like that old joke. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who was very tall. Someone asked him, how long should a man's legs be? And he said, long enough to reach the ground. Your first act should be as swift as you can make it. It should be as swift as you can make it. And by no means should it start to go past like 25% of the total length of the book. But I have to tell you, today's readers are so story savvy and their attention spans are maybe a little less than used to be. But I strongly recommend that you not say, well, I've got 25%, so I'll just fill all that in with setting and backstory and secondary characters. No, the reader is really waiting for the story to start. Get it going. Get it started. Some of your favorite books, even classic books, have stories that begin like instantly, How many pages does it take for Gandalf to show up in The Hobbit? Go to your well-thumbed copy of The Hobbit and go look and post it in the comments below. It does not take 20 pages for Gandalf to show up. Okay? What day does the Hunger Games begin? The day of the reaping. It's on page 1. If you can do that, do it. Okay? So that's how long your first act should be. Long enough to reach the ground. Okay. I am going to wrap up now with some words of encouragement and maybe a way of thinking about how to approach this. Yes, when we write a draft, it should be a hot mess. There's nothing wrong with that. Our first act can be way too long. It can create, it can have all of these issues I've described and more. Why not? It's a draft. But here's the thing. If you don't settle on your hero well enough, and you don't settle on the mission well enough to continue writing, you are putting yourself in a position where you're going to write a whole draft that is at high risk of just being completely off, being completely in the wrong direction, perhaps not even the book you want to write. So we want to balance. This is real world advice now from a working writer, right? I encourage you to, yes, don't be judgmental of your drafts. Get out there, scribble away, write that, that really awful first draft. But I also know how discouraging it can be to write a whole draft, to spend a year writing a whole draft and get to the end and say, you know what? I just actually never figured out what the plot was. I just didn't nail some really key questions at the beginning. And now I've spent all this time. It's very, very hard. It takes a lot of courage to go back and say, okay, well, let me start over. Writers do it all the time. It is not a sign of failure. It's not a sign that you shouldn't start over. If you've got, the book of your heart sitting in front of you and you're like, okay, I wrote this draft and this was my warm up. And now I'm really going to sort of start over and I'm going to write with a lot more clarity in mind. Do that. Absolutely do that. That is the right thing to do. But if you're, still working on a first draft, maybe you're still working on the beginnings of a first draft, and you can have the patience to slow down a little and make sure that your first act is like oriented in the right direction, you're going to get a much more productive drafting experience from that. You may have lots of work to do in your revisions. Chances are you will, but at least you will be revising the book that you want, as opposed to ending up with a draft that's like, this isn't even the plot that I wanted, right? This isn't enough of a plot to sustain a book, right? There's no iceberg. It never happened, right? You never even got to the good part. So most of this draft is just not going to be usable at all. So this is both encouragement. Let me put it this way. This is both encouragement to draft freely and enjoy the process, because there is no other way to do this work. But it's also just a little advice, seasoned advice, to make sure that at least like you've got your compass lined up, oriented in the right direction, and that you know what the first act's job is. And that when you draft your first act, don't just draft with wide-eyed innocence. Draft with a kind of a conscious intention to know what the first act's job is, to answer the very questions that I talked about today, right? Who is the hero? What is their need for change? What is unsustainable long-term about the situation that they are in before this story begins? That could be external conditions, internal conditions, timeline issues, ticking clock issues, or all three, or some combination of those, right? What happens to topple that house of cards, right? What happens? How does your hero step forward to be the one to react, start to drive this story forward, right? How does this become their problem? This is the hero's problem in a special way. It's Ebenezer Scrooge's problem to fix his spiritual condition, right? It's Meg Murray's problem to find her father. It's her problem in a special way. So what makes this your hero's problem in that unique, special way, right? And how And how does that get converted into a particular mission, a very clear thing that this hero is now going to do? And how fast do we get into Technicolor? How fast? How is that pacing working out for you, right? Don't imagine a plot where you think, oh, I know. She'll get sent to Oz and that'll be the midpoint of the book. I'm telling you right now, if that's what you imagine, you will end up with a first act that is so long, and you will end up not writing the middle, like actually not having the second act. And just in terms of proportion, second act should be like twice as long as first acts. The second act is most of the book. That's the Technicolor part where the hero is pursuing their mission, right? So the first act has got a huge amount of work to do in as short amount of time as you can manage to do it. And if you bear that in mind, I think you'll have a more efficient drafting process. And when you actually go ahead then and draft the second act and the third act, you're going to be in the right territory. You're going to have fixing to do afterwards, absolutely, but at least you'll be, heading in the right direction. Okay? I am so pleased to have shared this talk with you all today. I hope you found it of benefit. I see a bunch more folks came participating live. So great to see you all here. Alpha, great to see you. Hi, back at you. If anybody has any questions, this would be a good time to post them so that we can answer them. If you are thinking hard about the beginnings of maybe your work in progress, and you just sort of want to ponder and take this in for a little while, come back and post your questions in the comments. We can certainly keep the conversation going. Boy, if you can learn to write beginnings, you've done so much of the work. Like, you've really done so much of the work. This is a really, really important topic. This is really essential stuff for all writers to know. So I'm really glad you were here today. Anybody who came in late, I want to just remind you that I've got this little freebie for you waiting over at the Path of the Storyteller website. You can go over there and download it. www.pathofthestoryteller.com/challenge. And the first writing prompts in this collection of 30 writing prompts are all about writing the kinds of scenes that are going to end up in the beginning of your book. So you might want to focus on that. If you've already gotten this download and you're playing with it, you can go back and look at the early ones. If you haven't gotten it yet, go over and download it. It's completely free. And the first prompts are going to sort of remind you, I think, of some of the points I made in today's talk. Okay? Listen, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you soon. I am not going to be here next week because I'm actually going to be on vacation. But if you're on the Path of the Storyteller mailing list, you will get emails from me and you'll know when I'm back live. If you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, which I highly recommend, you will also get notified the next time I schedule a live stream. So please subscribe. And if you like the content, leaving a thumbs up is extremely helpful. And I appreciate it very much if you do that. All right, my storytelling friends, thanks for being here today. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, happy writing.